Good morning. Had enough rain for a while, the last day or two. So, not very good dog weather. So, I'm ready for some clear sun to come up again. Okay, so we are moving into chapter 4, and this is the prelude to the American Revolution. The question, of course, is why, with colonies all over the world, why it is a British colony that revolts, and why, of all the British colonies around the world, because they had places in Africa and India, of course, and in Asia, why it is the American British colonies that revolt and not any of the others. The list under the first slide, actually slide 2, makes a very clear point, and these are the same qualities, the same criteria that you can use around the world today, not only for revolutions, but particularly what makes a successful change of power, a successful revolution. Certainly in the Arab world, all across North Africa, there have been revolutions in the last 10 years, and it was predictable which would succeed, which would not, and what would happen. It was also fairly predictable, looking in hindsight, why the American Revolution not only would occur, but also succeed. So some of the factors, number one factor is demographics, the population and the type of population, and America is ready to revolt in 1776. Number two, you have to have the ideas, which we will get to next. The third thing you have to have is a little bit of practice. Revolts don't come out of the blue. And in America, we had a good amount of practice revolting against authority. So this video will deal with the change in demographics, which was crucial. This is why we have a revolution in 1776 and not in 1676 or 1700. You couldn't because you didn't have the right demographics. First of all, to have a revolution, you have to have a decent number of people involved. You have to have what we would call a critical mass. Population of Britain stayed roughly level for several centuries at about 8 million. The US population in 1700 or so was 250,000. Now, 250,000 people are not going to revolt against a nation of 18 million. They will be squashed like a bug. There are not enough of them. But by 1770, you have now in America 2.5 million people. That is 25% of the population of Britain. Now they have a fighting chance. Our population doubled roughly every 20 years, every generation, twice the rate of any place else in Europe. London, in fact, was actually declining in population. More people were dying than being born. What caused this high jump in population? Pretty clear. Number one, high birth rates and lower death rates than in Europe, but high birth rates. There's no birth control. Everybody has kids every 2 or 3 years. Families of 10, 12, 14 were not at all unusual. The other reason for the huge increase in population very quickly is hundreds of thousands of people moving in, very large immigration. People aren't moving to England, except in very tiny numbers. People are moving into North America by the hundreds of thousands per decade. Second factor you need is a young population for a revolution. Half of Americans were under 16 years old in 1770. Old people don't start revolutions. They're too worried, they have too much to lose. The other factor, of course, you need young people because you need what we still call cannon fodder, food for cannons. We have a revolution. I'm not going to fight. I'm too old. You are. Young people fight. Young people are in the military. The other factor that we forget about too is that the young are much more easily persuaded. The young are much more easily convinced of different ideas. Good example of this is try to convince your grandmother of any idea she doesn't particularly care about. Very, very difficult. On the other hand, younger people have not formed all their ideas, and it's much easier to convince them. And revolutions are revolutions. They are new things, new ideas. So you need a young population. This is why many of the Arab revolts are almost not doomed, but are bucking a huge amount of factors to succeed. And one of the key ones is their demographics. But for example, the population of Egypt today is roughly what America was. Half of the population of Egypt today is under the age of 16. So Egypt every year has to create 1.5 million, 2 million jobs for the kids that are moving into the workforce. That's almost impossible to do today in Egypt. It was not possible to do in the Americas, of course, because you had endless land once the Native Americans are wiped out. Everybody could have a small farm. Everybody could be a farmer. So this was not an issue in the Americas. The third factor is you need a middle-class population. And America had a substantial middle class, not in the South, but in the middle and the northern colonies particularly. The rich don't revolt. Why would they? They got what they want. They have no motive to revolt. And contrary to the stereotype, the poor don't start revolutions. They will often join it, and they are often vital to revolutions, but they do not initiate revolts. Why not? If you are dirt poor, what are you worried about? Great philosophical ideas? No. You're worried about how you're going to feed yourself, feed your family. There is no extra time, there is no extra energy to worry about how things are going to change or what political systems you're going to use. That comes from the middle class. They have something to gain, also something to lose. The middle and northern colonies, 95% small farmers, almost all middle class. We don't have serfs like Russia, and not so many wealthy. This is an interesting fact. American soldiers in the Revolution, and the British picked this out right away, were on average about 3.5 inches taller than the British. Why? Better diet. Also more meat in the diet, but absolutely better diet. Enough food and enough protein in the diet. So you have a diversified economy. America is pretty self-sufficient. Even if Britain cuts off trade, we can support ourselves with no problem. The fourth thing you need is an educated public. And we tend to forget this one. You need a literate population. This is another issue, has been in certain parts of the world. Very easy to start revolutions, and then they immediately turn to dictatorships. This did not happen in America, and one of the main reasons it didn't happen was that we had a highly educated populace. Not what we would call today, because at the time the literacy rate was about, for all the colonies, about 50%. In the North, remember those Puritans? In the North and in Pennsylvania, literacy rate was over 90%, male and female. In the South, however, much lower, but an average over all the colonies, about 50%. This is one of the highest in the world besides Scandinavia. We had 6 colleges already in America by the mid-1700s, and in every New England town, the first thing they built after the church was a school. All children are literate. Ben Franklin later on talks in the American Revolution, and he writes to a friend in Britain, "Every man among us reads." This is an important qualification, and we often forget this. Number one, you have to communicate between sections, between people, between officers and their men. You have to inform. You have to be able to follow directions, read the instructions if all else fails. And most important, you have to spread ideas. So the concepts, the ideas, and the information about the revolution had to be spread by the media of the time, which was newspapers and the printed word. So literacy was a crucial factor. Literacy rate, let's say in Russia at the same time, is like 2%. Even in France, well under 10%. They had to wait for a revolution. But in America, a very high literacy rate. The last factor, possibly the most important, was the type of people that you have. And America had a very heterogeneous population after 1700. Before 1700 or so, Those who came, 90% came from Britain, came from England. After 1700, 75%, 3 out of 4 who come, are non-English. They have no connection to England. Our first census after the Revolution, 1790, by law, and remember we're doing one again now, and please, if you have not or know people who have not filled out the census, please, for the love of God, fill out the census, because for the next 10 years, government money is allocated by the census results. So if we don't document everybody, and the census is closed to immigration authorities, but if we don't document everybody who is living in the state of Texas, we lose billions of dollars per year, and that money goes directly to the poor. So this is an important thing. Anyway, the first census, 60% English, 9% German, 8% Scots, 4% Irish, 6% Scotch Irish, I'll talk about that in a minute, 3% Dutch. We even had a few Italians and a few Poles and a very few Asians at the same time. Thomas Paine, Common Sense, said, and I'm quoting, "Europe, not England, is the parent of America." And this was true after 1700. They had a lot of reason to leave different places. The Industrial Revolution was kicking in. People were thrown off their land. Their land was enclosed in enclosure acts to raise sheep on, because the Industrial Revolution, the first factories were textile factories that used wool. They spun wool into yarns. So we don't need all these little farmers. What we need is a whole lot of sheep pastures. So the enclosure acts basically threw off a lot of poor people in England and in Britain. Okay, so the 3 main groups that come, slide number 3, that changed America drastically. The first group, besides Englishmen who are coming anyway, America has always attracted, and still does, those who don't fit in, those who are rebellious, those who fight authority. This is from the beginning of our country. It still kind of works that way. First large group that comes, and all of these rough numbers, about 100,000, I don't care about the numbers, but about 100,000, probably more, were convicts, were prisoners. The king was delighted to empty his prisons because he didn't have to pay the upkeep on the prisoners or the staff to run them. And he could also send prisoners to the Americas and sell the indenture papers on them. Because if you wanted an indentured servant, you paid the passage, and in many cases, you paid the king for releasing the prisoner into your hands. Of course, this ends with the revolution. The king can no longer send prisoners. Where does he send them after the revolution? And we all know this answer, Australia, which was founded as a purely prison colony for many years. Over 200,000 English prisoners were sent to Australia, a long ways away. This is why when you're in Australia, you never ask people about their ancestry, because if they've been there for any time, they probably go back to prisoners. Remember, there were 200 different capital offenses in Britain, let alone the non-death penalty offenses. So Virginia became, particularly because there was a huge need for labor, tobacco in Virginia, and I'm quoting here, Virginia became a sink where England deposits her filth and scum. Thank you very much. Samuel Johnson, great British writer, at the same time, Americans are, quote, a race of convicts who ought to be grateful for anything we allow them short of hanging. So the impression in Europe of America was a bunch of prisoners. Not exactly true, but there was a very high percentage, particularly in some areas. Remember, Georgia was founded as a prison colony. Virginia, the southern colonies, where there's a huge need for indentured labor. Less so in the north, in Massachusetts and the Puritan colonies. The second huge group that comes, again, roughly 100,000, are the Germans from Germany. And we talked about this with Pennsylvania. They came primarily to Pennsylvania, also to New York, the middle colonies. This is the largest non-English speaking group that comes for a long time. In the first census, 10% of Americans were speaking German. And in fact, they talked about making Pennsylvania a German-speaking colony. German would be the first language in Pennsylvania. There were more German speakers than English speakers in Pennsylvania for a while. The Germans are not prisoners. They are coming voluntarily. They are coming for religious persecution. They are coming for economic opportunity. They are all Lutherans. They are all Protestants. Germans then and now were known to be great farmers. They came with their own language, their schools, their churches, and they continued in their own communities separately for a long time and slowly began to blend into the American population. We know a lot about German immigrants because in Texas, when Texas was first opened, besides Americans, large numbers of Germans came. They landed in Galveston, and being Germans, they said, we're not going to settle in Galveston. And they moved inland. When they got to the first good land, they settled and became very successful farmers. We'll talk about this with Texas. Germans hated slavery completely, never used slaves. But look at areas east of Austin, Brenham, Schulenburg, a lot of those towns. Look at New Braunfels later on, also settled by Germans. They knew good land. You get to good land, Fredericksburg is another one, and you immediately create a prosperous farm. So they're farmers and they're settled. They find a good place and they stay there. The last group I could go on and talk about probably for hours and hours. I got to cut it short. The Scots Irish. Again, about 100,000. They come after 1700 and they come in waves. Now, different groups here. The Irish, there are Irish who come, but the Irish were dirt poor. They were basically almost slave labor in Ireland to English landlords. There are not so many of them that come, but a lot of the Scots came. The Scots Irish were Scots, Presbyterian Scots, Protestant Scots, who were sent to Ireland, particularly Northern Ireland, to pacify the Irish and to dominate, basically to set up systems and farms and be landlords in Ireland for the English, because Scotland is part of England. All of these groups, all three of them, were basically treated as second-class citizens, which is a motive to go. In Scotland, there was a grand total of Scotland at the time probably had close to 1 million people, and in the entire country of Scotland, 40,000 could vote, and most of those were British landlords who also owned huge pieces of land and employed the Scots as grunt labor, same as in Ireland. In Ireland, only 1 out of 250 adult males voted. Why? You couldn't be Catholic and vote in Ireland. You had to be Anglican. Well, that solved that problem real quickly. All kinds of restrictions on the Scots and the Irish. They couldn't vote. For a long time, they couldn't serve in the army. They couldn't own a gun. This leads straight to the Second Amendment, of course. They couldn't become a teacher in the schools. They couldn't marry a Protestant because the Scots, many of the Scots were Catholic as well as the Irish. They couldn't own a horse worth more than, let's say at the time, $10. If they stole anything worth more than a couple of bucks, it was a hanging offense. 75% of Ireland in the 1700s is Catholic. The rest are British landlords, and those 75% owned less than 10% of the land. So it tells you why people were willing to immigrate. Particularly the Scots. What do we know about the Scots? If you've seen Braveheart, you know all about the Scots. They have been fighting the English for independence for centuries, since about 1300. They finally became independent about 30 years ago. They are not an independent country, but they are self-governing. They have their own parliament in Edinburgh, and they are loosely connected to Great Britain today. But for many, many years, they were under English control, and they fought it. Rats, lice, and Scotchmen, you find them the whole world over, unquote. So they left. They had no life in Scotland. They were barred from everything. In America, everything was open to them. Even Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration talks about Scottish and foreign mercenaries. One thing the Scots could do is fight in other people's armies. For a long time, they were banned from the English army because they were traitors in a way. Hessian officer in the Revolution talks about the Revolution. Call this revolution by whatever name you want, only don't call it an American rebellion. It is nothing but a Scots Irish rebellion. They are the most God-provoking Democrats this side of hell. Scots are descendant. Think about what a Scotsman looks like. He is tall, he has reddish or blondish hair, kind of lanky. Does this ring a bell anyplace? He is very much like the Vikings. And that's exactly correct. The Vikings occupied Scotland and Ireland for centuries after 1000 AD. Their genetic code is very prominent in Scots and Irish. That's why they look kind of the same. What is the Viking job occupation? Their MO basically is they fight. So do the Scots traditionally. They are clannish, just like the Vikings were. They mistrust all authority, particularly British authority. The Scottish clans, you only owed obedience to your clan chieftain. Most of the Highland Scots were Catholic. They were being persecuted by the crown, and they revolted. Scotland revolted in 1715. They were supposed to get help from the Spanish. The Spanish fleet was destroyed in a storm, and the revolt was brutally crushed. There is a flood of Scots who come to America after that revolt, and then Bonnie Prince Charlie, 1745. There is an almost successful revolt against the English in 1745. If you look at the next couple of slides, you will see what Scotland looked like and why they were willing to move. I'm quoting from an English traveler. "I never saw human wretchedness like this, even among the Negroes of America. They lived worse than slaves," basically. They leave, particularly after the Jacobite Rebellion in 1745. Thank goodness it failed because tens of thousands left. If you stayed and you were an adult male, the English crown picked you up, either put you to prison labor or shot you on the spot, because the assumption was you had rebelled against the king, you had committed treason. So their options are stay and be shot or hung, or go to the Americas. And tens of thousands of the Highland Catholic Scots came to America. We owe a lot to the Scots. I could go on and on about this. Thomas Jefferson has some Scottish or Welsh ancestry. Again, tall, reddish hair here. Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, a lot of our presidents, a lot of our key figures. Andrew Jackson actually was Scottish, came from Scotland. So we have a strong strain of Scottish background in American history. So before 1775, you have the mass immigration of three very large groups. You have prisoners. What loyalty do they owe to the British government or the king? Zero. In fact, they would like to shoot him dead if they could. So you have those. You have another 100,000 Germans. What loyalty do they have to England or to the English crown? They're not necessarily opposed to it, but they're certainly not for it. They have no loyalty whatsoever. And the last group, the most important, I think, are the Scots, the Irish, and the Scots Irish. And they detest the English. So if you look at our army in the Revolution, a number of the commanders are Scots ancestry. So thank goodness they came. Thank goodness their revolution failed because it allowed our revolution to succeed. So we will go on in the next section and talk about the change in ideas, because you can't have a revolution unless you're revolting against something. And there are new ideas after 1700. Stay safe.